Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about the legacy of Boston. Now, Boston as a band only had a small handful of albums, and in their golden era, they really only had three. There was the debut, self-titled in 1976, the very similar sort of sequel, and I say that in a good way, follow-up Don't Look Back in 78, and then after taking almost a decade-long break, they came out with Third Stage in 86, and they later on came out with a couple of other albums, but those were really the big three. And so, what you might be asking is, how does a band that only really had three core albums, how come they were so influential? And there were multiple reasons. The reason most people focus on is that band leader and main songwriter Tom Scholz was a mechanical and engineering and musical genius. He was a sort of one-man band in every sense, even insofar as he built his own music studio in his house, which the label wasn't all that excited about, but most of the songs and most of the tracks, the stems that ended up on the album, both the first and the second, were in fact recorded in Shaw's basement. And so there was that novelty of the one-man band, but of course, when it came time to go live and on the road, Schultz and singer Brad Delp brought other musicians who were very, very capable with them, and Boston then became a real band, even though originally it was Schultz who then brought in Brad Delp to provide wonderful vocal work. But there were other reasons that the album was so big. By the mid 70s, people wanted really to be happy. The early 70s, much like the late 60s, was dominated by a lot of contemplative music. The Vietnam War was still going on, the civil rights movement was still in the air. People were talking about serious and heady subjects. But by the time Nixon came and went, and inflation was still bad, and now oil and gas were more expensive. People just wanted to party. And for the people in the sort of urban dance scene, that ended up becoming disco as funk and soul created a more commercialized subgenre. But for the rockers out there, they wanted to have some fun too, but they still wanted to rock. And this is where Boston's album, particularly the debut, fits in so well because every song on that album really helped to define what FM radio would be from the mid 70s, frankly, all the way up into the 90s. And this was music that was generally feel good music. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still great freeform DJs that played a bit of everything from feel good music to heady music to psychedelic tripped out music to experimental music. And that would really remain until the deregulation and corporatization of FM radio in the 90s. But this album helped form FM radio into its first sort of tangible format, and this was known as AOR, album oriented rock. And this meant that the songs that were played on these stations weren't pop singles, they were songs that were derived from popular rock albums. And people have tried to pin the genre into a particular sound, which isn't easy to do necessarily, although there are sort of your staples of AOR rock, and Boston is one of them. But more than that, they really helped to invent that genre. It was one of these genres where people say, right, you've got a band like Boston, and then came bands like Foreigner and Journey and Oreo Speedwagon, after years of being more underground, broke it huge. And the list could go on. And I would say if there was any one album that really gave birth to what AOR would be for the remainder of the 70s and into the 80s, it was this album. And every song on it was practically a hit, and that was almost as true for Don't Look Back, the second album. They just really had a formula for success. The production was wonderful, very layered and overdubbed, but when you had the right number of musicians out on the road live, it worked. And there are videos of Boston as an actual band playing live in the 70s, and it really sounds great. So there was the layered production, which sounded equally as good, frankly, on a home stereo system as it did on a car hi-fi. They got that balance right, which wasn't easy to do, to sound good on both without sacrificing one for another. The lyrics were feel good and memorable. The tunes were upbeat and very much in that sort of in major keys, and it just had that right formula that defined the age of rock music where it was at its most successful. Because when people talk about the origins of rock and roll in the 50s, its heady days in the 60s, it was really in the 70s and 80s when the genre was at its peak. In the 90s, it began a slow decline, and hip hop eventually overtook it as the sort of most innovative and most interesting form of music on the pop charts. And then by the sort of 2000s, it was a combination of dance music and hip hop derivatives, with rock being really quite peripheral. But in the 70s and 80s, rock was king. And one of the reasons was this AOR style that if any one band really invented, that would be Boston. I'm sure you plan to listen to the album today. Why not? Or the other ones, because they're all really good. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.